Have you ever noticed that when massive, highly anticipated decisions are made, whether that's by governments or central banks or, massive tech giants, the actual results out there in the real world rarely match the grand announcements?
Yeah, it almost never plays out the way they say it will.
Right. You watch the press conference, you read the white paper, and it all sounds incredibly precise. Like, it sounds like pure engineering.
Hmm.
A lever gets pulled, and a very specific gear is supposed to turn. But then, a year or two later, you look around and realize, the gear didn't turn at all.
Not even a little bit.
The machine is doing something completely different. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're getting into a really fascinating set of research today about this exact disconnect.
It creates a very modern kind of psychological whiplash for all of us because we've been conditioned to expect a straight line between an action and an outcome.
Yeah, input equals output.
Exactly. We assume A leads directly to B, but instead we end up with this bizarre, warped reality that nobody actually planned for.
I think we should ground this right away for you listening with some of the specific examples from our stack of research today, because the phenomenon is everywhere once you start looking
Oh,
for it.
absolutely everywhere.
Take artificial intelligence. Right now, there are just eye-watering investments pouring into AI infrastructure. Billions of dollars are moving across the globe with the literal click of a button.
Just massive capital flows.
Yeah, and the stated intent there is rapid, limitless technological scaling.
But the physical phenomenon we actually observe is a hard crash into reality
Right.
because the electricity grid cannot catch up to the energy demands of these massive new data centers. So we're suddenly looking at local power shortages, and tech companies are attempting to buy entire nuclear power plants.
It's just wild to think about.
It really is. And there's a scramble for cooling water, too. The digital intent is limitless, right? But the physical reality is profoundly constrained.
Or look at global economics. This is another great example from the sources. Aggressive economic sanctions get applied to a country with a very clear punitive goal.
Cut off their revenue, force compliance.
Exactly. But the result isn't submission. The result is this incredibly complex, warped global supply chain.
Right, you don't get compliance, you get evasion.
Yeah. You suddenly have, like, shadow fleets of unregulated oil tankers roaming the oceans and these random middleman countries getting massively rich just by laundering the trade.
And you see the exact same pattern in monetary policy, too. A central bank decides to ease interest rates.
Lower the cost of borrowing.
Right. The intent is clear and completely well-meaning. They want to stimulate the broader economy, get loans flowing, and help average citizens afford homes or, start small businesses.
But what actually happens?
Well, the phenomenon that actually materializes is that institutional asset prices skyrocket. Housing becomes completely unaffordable, and the wealth gap just widens even further.
It's maddening. I mean, we live in a world where actions are absolutely definitively taken.
Nobody is sitting on their hands.
Exactly. The money is moving, the policies are enacted, the code is deployed, but it's like the real world is actively rejecting the master plan. And our core mission today for this deep dive is to just calmly explore why. Why don't actions reach their intended results anymore?
Well, when we look at these examples, we have to recognize that we are not just looking at a series of unlucky flukes or coincidences.
Right, it's too consistent for that.
It is. We're looking at a recognizable recurring structure. The world operates in a specific way now, and this wild divergence between intent and reality is actually baked right into that structure.
Okay, so to figure out why this is happening, we probably have to let go of the easiest excuse. Because I know my first instinct is always to just blame human error.
Oh, of course. We all do that.
We want a villain. Or at least some incompetent bureaucrat who forgot to carry the one in their spreadsheet.
It is incredibly tempting to point at a decision maker and assume they just made a bad call or ran the wrong math. But the sources highlight something much more unsettling, honestly.
Unsettling how?
Well, the systems aren't breaking down at the top. Decisions are actually being made very efficiently. Money is flowing exactly where it's instructed to go. The administrative frameworks, the financial markets, the algorithms, they're operating at peak capacity.
So the people in the situation rooms or the corporate boardrooms are, for the most part, pulling the right levers within their highly structured environments.
Yes. Their logic is completely sound. The policy is beautifully drafted.
And yet the outcomes still violently diverge from the intent.
Right, and that divergence is the core puzzle here. It isn't a simple failure or a careless miscalculation. The decision makers might actually be making the mathematically correct choices based on every single model they have available to them.
I was trying to visualize this earlier when I was reading through the sources. It feels like driving a car and turning the steering wheel perfectly to navigate a sharp curve.
Okay, I like this.
The steering column works flawlessly. The axles turn mechanically exactly as they're designed to. The tires pivot perfectly. But the car slides completely sideways into a ditch anyway.
Because of the environment.
Right, and society is standing around pointing fingers, analyzing the driver's grip on the wheel, when we really should be looking at the solid sheet of ice on the road.
That is exactly it. We obsess over the driver's hands and we completely ignore the road itself. The road, in your analogy, is the underlying structure of reality.
Okay.
If the driver isn't the core problem and the steering mechanism actually works, the question becomes, what happens to the action before it hits the road? Like, why does it deform?
Because if the intent is pure and the decision is logical, something must be happening on that journey between the pristine boardroom and the messy physical world.
Exactly. And our source material breaks this down by dividing the world into two very distinct domains. Understanding the friction between these two halves is how you explain the ice on the road.
So what are the two domains?
The first is what we call the controllable domain.
This is where intent lives.
Yes, exactly. The controllable domain encompasses policymaking, investment flows, software engineering, global finance. It is incredibly fluid and highly responsive.
Right.
A developer can rewrite 1,000 lines of code overnight. A bank can wire $1 billion from New York to Tokyo in milliseconds.
Right.
A government can draft a new regulatory mandate in an afternoon. It is an environment of almost zero friction.
I click a button, the spreadsheet updates, the system obeys.
Fast and frictionless.
The feedback loop is instant. So then what's the second domain?
Then you have the second half, the uncontrollable domain. That frictionless, pristine intent must pass through this second domain to actually become a phenomenon, to become reality.
And this domain is different?
Very different. The uncontrollable domain is made up of physical resources, ingrained cultural habits, physical logistics, complex geography, and above all, time.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on that framing just a little bit.
Sure.
Because logistics and resources are technically controllable, aren't they? I mean, human beings build massive cargo ships that cross oceans. We dig miles deep into the earth to extract copper and coal. We build entire cities from scratch. That feels like a massive amount of control over the physical world. We definitely manipulate the physical world, absolutely. But you have to think about it in terms of relative friction.
Relative friction.
Yeah. Compared to the frictionless click of a button deploying a new software update, physical reality deeply, deeply resists change.
Okay, I see what you mean.
A CEO can decide to build a massive new AI data center in a single Tuesday morning board meeting. That decision happens in the controllable domain. Bam, it's done.
Right.
But actually securing the local zoning permits, pouring thousands of tons of concrete, mining the copper for the high-voltage wiring, and waiting for the local power plant to generate enough gigawatts.
That takes a decade.
Exactly. That takes 10 years. That is the uncontrollable domain.
So the action is born really fast, but it has to cross a border into this dense, resistant reality.
And in that passage across the border, the action doesn't just get delayed, it gets fundamentally deformed.
Deformed.
Yes. The intent is one thing, but by the time it survives the crossing into physical reality, the phenomenon that actually emerges is often unrecognizable.
So a brilliant investment, or a well-meaning policy, crosses the border, hits the mud of the uncontrollable domain, and just warps.
Precisely.
And the sources map out 3 specific mechanisms of distortion here. 3 ways the road ruins the steering, basically.
Let's get into those.
The first one is called a speed mismatch, or sometimes they call it shear.
Think of it as the violent friction between fast and slow. Decision-making today, especially within that controllable domain, is practically instantaneous.
Right.
We have high-speed algorithmic trading, real-time supply chain adjustments, rapid policy shifts based on, like, trending daily data. But physical infrastructure, human populations, natural resources, they still move at a crawl.
It's like tectonic plates grinding against each other.
Yeah.
Which takes us right back to that AI and power grid example from earlier.
Exactly.
The intent from the tech sector is to scale globally right this second.
Yeah.
The capital moves at the speed of light, but the physical grid moves at the speed of bureaucracy and concrete curing times.
and the manufacturing of massive electrical transformers, which, by the way, currently have a multi-year backlog.
So the intent hits this speed mismatch and deforms.
Right. Instead of a smooth technological rollout, the friction creates massive heat. We see skyrocketing local energy costs for regular citizens, rolling blackouts in vulnerable areas, tech companies suddenly trying to bypass the public grid entirely.
The result is totally warped by the shear.
Exactly. And that invisible friction leads to the second distortion, which honestly I find the most eerie of the three.
Oh, the silence.
Yes, the sources call it silence.
Yeah, this one is creepy. How does silence work here?
Well, silence refers to the lack of an expected reaction. In a healthy responsive system, if you push something, it pushes back. You feel the resistance.
Right.
But in the uncontrollable domain, a policy or an economic force often applies massive pressure, and the market or the local institution stays strangely quiet. Nothing seems to happen.
And decision makers look at that silence and usually celebrate, right? They think,
Oh.
oh, the system absorbed the policy perfectly.
Yeah.
No protests, no market crash. We nailed it.
But the silence isn't compliance. It is the invisible accumulation of pressure. The membrane between the two domains isn't adapting, it's hardening.
Wow.
The pressure builds up underneath, completely unobserved because it doesn't trigger any immediate alarms on the clean little dashboards in the controllable domain.
You know, anyone who has ever done basic mechanical work or woodworking knows this exact feeling.
Oh, tell me.
You're tightening a heavy steel bolt with a wrench. And as it gets tighter, the physical resistance should naturally increase. It should get harder and harder to turn.
Oh, right, that's the feedback.
But occasionally you're applying a ton of force and suddenly the wrench feels completely loose and silent. It just keeps turning smoothly. And for a split second you think, oh, it's threading perfectly. Until suddenly, S&P. The head of the bolt just shears off entirely.
That is a perfect analogy. The metal was stretching beyond its limits right up until the catastrophic failure. And we have seen this happen on a massive scale in recent history.
Like when?
Think about the 2008 financial crisis. For years, the financial sector was turning the wrench on subprime mortgages, the controllable domain, the banking models, the complex derivatives, the ratings agencies. They saw pure silence. The model said the risk was perfectly distributed.
The dashboards showed record profits. The broader economy stayed quiet. Home prices kept going up, and people just kept taking the loans.
Because the distortion was happening completely under the surface. The underlying reality, the actual ability of human beings in the uncontrollable domain to pay those mortgages over the long term was stretching and warping.
So the silence wasn't a sign of economic health.
Not at all. It was the accumulation of incredible stress. And when the snap finally happened, it wasn't a gradual, polite market correction.
No, it definitely wasn't polite.
It was a non-linear, catastrophic jump that almost brought down the entire global economy.
That is terrifying. Our models literally interpret the silence before the snap as success.
Exactly.
Okay, so if speed mismatch is the friction of time and silence is the hidden accumulation of pressure, that leaves the third distortion from the research, compatibility error.
Right. The clash between global rationality and local reality.
Break that down for us. What does that mean?
Imagine a massive global initiative. Let's say a new international environmental regulation drafted at a major summit. In the controllable domain, sitting at a nice desk in a global capital, the logic is flawless.
It makes rational sense on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. It maximizes efficiency, it hits the carbon reduction goals, and it creates a uniform standard. That is global rationality.
It's the perfect software update.
Right. But then it tries to install on the hardware of the uncontrollable domain.
And what happens?
It hits a local fishing village or a mid-sized farming town or a complex, deeply entrenched cultural tradition of commerce, and the global logic completely fails to function.
They just clash.
The operating systems are simply incompatible. It's like trying to run the latest smartphone app on a 30-year-old desktop computer. The local reality simply does not have the ports to accept the global intent.
I want to take that analogy further because it's not just a technical glitch, it's human friction.
For sure.
Let's say that global regulation mandates a sudden shift to electric agricultural equipment to cut emissions. On the global spreadsheet, it's a necessary, highly logical step.
But the local reality relies on diesel tractors, decades-old mechanical repair networks, and very specific seasonal harvesting timelines. The local economy cannot physically or financially absorb the mandate overnight.
So the policy doesn't just quietly fail, it actively deforms.
Mm,
The local farmers can't afford the new gear, so a massive black market for old diesel parts emerges.
exactly.
Political resentment skyrockets. Maybe local officials just start faking the compliance data to keep the global regulators happy and keep their funding flowing.
Which happens all the time.
Right. The initial intent was to cleanly lower emissions, but the actual phenomenon is a shadow economy, broken trust, and systemic evasion.
The passage through the uncontrollable domain basically forced the intent to warp. Speed mismatch, silence, and compatibility error. Those three things guarantee that the original intent never, ever survives its journey intact.
This feels like a massive paradigm shift. If intent is basically guaranteed to be deformed by these structural forces, we have to completely change how we view the world.
We do. It requires mourning the loss of an old, very comforting premise. We all grew up with a baseline assumption about how reality works. If you make the right decision, you will get the right result.
Input equals output.
Exactly.
A leads to B. If we just elect the right person, or write the right code, or invest in the right company, the problem will be neatly solved.
And the sources argue that this is simply no longer true. We have shifted into a reality where the pathway of an action is fundamentally nonlinear.
I want to be careful here, though. Agency hasn't disappeared, has it? I mean, people are still in charge. Presidents sign bills, CEOs launch products, central banks set rates.
Oh, agency is absolutely still there. Choices are being made every single second. But because the pathway is nonlinear, the responsibility for an outcome becomes incredibly blurred.
Blurred how?
Well, think about it. If a CEO makes a completely logical decision based on perfect data, but it's deformed by a 3-year delay in copper mining and an unforeseen cultural backlash in a foreign market, whose fault is the failure?
You can't just judge the driver anymore when the road itself is actively altering the direction of the car.
Right. It becomes nearly impossible to fairly evaluate success or failure based just on the initial decision.
But isn't there a danger there? Because the controllable domain feels so frictionless to the people operating it. Because clicking the button is so easy, the investments and the policies never really stop.
They don't. They just keep pushing.
Right. If the economy isn't responding the way they want, they pump more money in. If the AI isn't scaling fast enough, they throw another $100 billion at it.
Yes. And because of the distortions we just talked about, adding more pressure just amplifies the weird, deformed outcomes.
We don't get a smoothly functioning AI utopia.
No, we get a fragile, overtaxed power grid and nuclear bidding wars. We don't get a beautifully stimulated middle class. We get spiking living costs, housing bubbles, and institutional silence.
We are just turning that stripped bolt harder and harder, waiting for the snap.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. If the path always deforms the intent, does that make the initial decision completely meaningless?
Yeah, if the road is going to throw me in the ditch anyway, does it even matter how I turn the steering wheel?
The decision isn't meaningless, but we are obsessing over the wrong variable entirely.
Okay, what should we be obsessing over?
Well, we spend the vast majority of our political and economic energy arguing about what to do. What should the intent be? What is the perfect policy? But in this new structure, it is no longer about what you do. It is about where it passes through.
The path.
The path. The path determines the outcome. If you don't map the uncontrollable domain, if you don't understand the speed limits of physical reality, if you aren't listening for the terrifying silence of an overloaded system, if you don't respect the stubbornness of local realities, then your intent is completely irrelevant.
Wow.
The structure of the pathway is the actual dictator of the phenomenon.
So to bring this full circle for you listening, we started by looking at a very frustrating modern paradox. Massive actions never seem to match their intended outcomes. But what we're really looking at is a major structural shift in reality.
We have moved away from a world defined by problems of decision-making. We are now living in a world defined by problems of the pathway. We have to start studying the deformation itself.
And that leaves us with some really profound open questions from the research. Where exactly is the action being deformed right now? We know about the violent friction of the speed mismatch. We know about the dangerous silence of unobserved pressure. And we know about the incompatibility of global logic and local life.
But are there other layers? Are there completely unseen membranes in this pathway that we haven't even learned to observe yet? That is the real frontier here. Understanding that this friction isn't an accident or a glitch, it is the defining feature of our era.
Here is a provocative thought for you to mull over tomorrow. When you look at the news or you see a headline about some massive new government policy or a corporate rollout that seems to be failing or acting strangely, Don't immediately ask who made the wrong choice or who screwed up.
Try to change your lens.
Exactly. Change your lens. Ask yourself, what hidden membrane did that pristine decision just crash into on its way to becoming reality? The driver might be steering perfectly, but the ice on the road is what actually determines where we end up.